When you're villain in your vial, you never go out of style. Here's a look at the Mattel Master Universe Masterverse Vintage Collection Skeletor. This Master Universe Vintage Collection action figure of Skeletor is designed at Masterverse 7-inch scale with 30 points of articulation. This collectible design of the Motu ultimate villain with evil red eyes glowing from his face comes with signature Ram's Head Havoc Staff and Power Sword. The evil Lord of Destruction comes beautifully packaged in a window box suitable for display. I always look forward to future Skeletor figures, especially ones that look back to the past. Before, though, we get a closer look at the Masterverse Vintage Collection Skeletor, of course, you know me. I'm going to take the tape measure and see how tall the figure stands. If I'm looking at this correctly, because I don't have a bone face or glowing red eyes, not that I'm aware of at least, Skeletor, in fact, is standing at 7 inches in height, or the figure clocks in at about 17.5 centimeters tall. In fact, if I want to stay stuck in the past, I could probably even compare him with a vintage Skeletor. Not one from my childhood. I actually found this at a local toy show. The face has unfortunately been colored, and he's missing some of his accessories, but at least until I find myself a better-looking Skeletor, he'll do the part nicely. Not as good of a part, of course, is the original version 1 Skeletor from the origin days. That's an ugly-looking mug. Here's also what the figure looks like with the Matty Collector Skeletor. I still have a lot of my Matty Collector Master Universe Classics figures. Love the look of that line. Here's also a figure that I do want to bring into. Now, he was a good stand-in if you want a classical-looking Skeletor. This was, in fact, the Masterverse New Eternia Skeletor. Of course, you had to strip away some of the barbarian parts. But underneath that, though, if you swapped it out for the classic head sculpt, yeah, that was a good-looking Skeletor. Here's also what he looks like, too, with the Battle Armor Skeletor. Yeah, we have a whole lot of these. And, yeah, if we're going to be also looking, of course, at the Vintage Collection of Skeletor, it would make some sense to put in his foil as well. Here's what he looks like with the Vintage Collection He-Man. I'm going to want to bring back that He-Man in a moment, so I'll keep him pretty close. Looking, though, first at the accessories that come included with bone face. Yeah, one thing you did want to make notice of is at the beginning of this video when I was kind of unboxing everything, there was a little side compartment space. Normally it would have like a little hole on the top you would know to put your finger in there, open it up, and find treasures inside. There wasn't that time around, and actually it was a much smaller looking quarter, so you want to make sure before you discard everything, why am I waving my hand so frantically? Before you discard away the packaging, just check to the side, because there in fact was a little mystery bag. And what was inside the mystery bag, you may all be asking, well at least 2 of you may be asking. For those 2 that are asking, the figure does come included with a closed fist, and he comes included with a relaxed hand. Both of those can be at your disposal, providing, of course, you check that bag before you throw and heave everything into the recycling bin. But it doesn't just end there, though. Also included inside is Skeletor's version of the Power Sword, which is a nice-looking sword. Man, oh man, that looks pretty cool. I don't know where I've put the actual vintage He-Man sword, but I would imagine it's probably going to be identical to this. Well, clearly not going to be identical, at least in the metallic purple. But man, oh man, that's a nice-looking sword. There's some storage space, obviously, already in his hand, so he can grip the sword in either one of his hands. Or, if you look on the back of the figure as well, located on the back of his armor, there is also a slot here, a holster, that you can basically slide the sword in there. Sheath it, store it away, if you want to have the figure displayed with something else instead. My only one real worry is with the way that the sword slides in place. Not that it's tight, but I wonder, though, if it's going to start to, cause little stress marks or kind of like little wear marks on the top of the blade. Not that it's necessarily going to be rubbing too much against plastic, but also sheathing it and unsheathing it repeatedly. I would imagine, though, I don't know, maybe that's going to cause a little bit of a wear mark. Let's at least, though, keep that in place. The one other included accessory it has with Skeletor is, of course, his Havoc Staff. As I spin this around, I can't help but think I've seen this Havoc Staff before. It wasn't the Revelation Skeletor, and it wasn't I don't think it was the new Eternia Skeletor. If you happen to know down below, let me know down below. One thing that's really cool, though, about the Havoc Staff, it's large. It's got very large horns on the side. It's actually also a different color from the rest of the handle. You'll notice, though, that when you look at the handle, it's actually a much lighter kind of grape purple. And yet, though, the top of the actual ram head is a much darker shade of that. Kind of wish that they would have kept all the colors consistent, that the top of the Havoc Staff would have been the exact same color as the rest of the handle. Anyways, neither here nor there. Let's go ahead, though, and take the Havoc Staff and fit into his hand. The benefit already of coming out of the packaging with gripping hands, Skeletor, you don't have to worry about at all swapping out the hands. Basically, just take yourself the Havoc Staff and it fits perfectly in place. Skeletor will be on my display with Havoc Staff in hand, and probably just, going to be keeping his version of the Power Sword on the back of his body. Let's remove all the accessories right now. By the way, if you wanted to see what it looks like to swap out the hands, again, it's just a case of holding on to the forearms. Don't let go, whatever you do, just in case he wants to scurry away. And just sort of twist the hand back and forth until finally you remove it. take the hand you want to then use. Whether evil or not, the thumbs will always go in and pop that in place instead. Because Skeletor tend to have only usually one relaxed hand, one gripping hand, to kind of keep consistent with the original retro toy, I might just do the same. Might have him with a relaxed hand on one side, a gripping hand on the other. So let's move all those accessories out of the way. I guess really what we could do too is take the sword off and put that out of the way as well. I did already mention I was going to be bringing back in vintage He-Man. Here's what vintage He-Man looks like. For me at least, I still think it's an ugly looking He-Man. I know some have championed this in the comments section when I did the review of him, saying that, you know, he was a good looking He-Man and he looked a lot like his vintage self. I will say though, for the time that I've had this guy stored away, my interest level in him has increased just a little bit more than what it was before. I hated the head sculpt before of He-Man. The more time that I'm looking at it, I don't hate it as much. I still think it's ugly though. But I mean, when you start to compare him with the uglier looking He-Man that we're getting now with the Masterverse line, why are we using that head sculpt now as a He-Man moving forward? This one actually doesn't look all that bad now that I'm looking at it. The one thing that's still consistent though, and the one thing that's bothering me about this line, is the use of the larger torsos. Why, though, I brought in He-Man is because it seems like they are using the same bodies. Not necessarily the arms, of course, because Skeletor here does have the little fins that he has on his forearms. But if you look at his biceps, you look at his shoulders, and you look more specifically at his torso, it looks like they are using the same bodies. The one thing always really bothered me about He-Man, too, was like the shape of his chest. He was very swollen up here. Very swollen. At least it did still give him a neck, but I found like his chest was way too big. Had they just toned it down a bit, it looks almost like Rob Liefeld had drawn this. I think that like the torso pecs were way too big on He-Man, and unfortunately with Skeletor, what seems to be using the same body, he's carried over that same ugly trend. Now, some may look at that and say, well, you know, if you look at the original vintage Skeletor would have also had that as well. I don't know if I would say that. Where's my vintage Skeletor? I just finished putting him away. Let's see if I can go grab him off to the side here. The one thing about vintage Skeletor, as I reach back into the bag here, vintage Skeletor, there he is right there. There he is right there. If you look at the bodies, his top torso is still large. I get that. But his pectorals, though, are still much smaller. I don't know why they felt the need to give Skeletor such a big of a body like this, because it kind of throws the proportions off of the figure quite considerably. All right, I'm going to keep him close because I might just end up bringing Skeletor back in. The one thing I also did want to keep in here, at least for this review, is the new Eternia version of Skeletor. Now, granted, yes, it does still look a lot like the classic days for Skeletor. The one thing I really like always about these bodies, though, is if you look at the torso, they're proportionally better for the rest of his frame. His arms, his lower legs, all seem to match a good size with the rest of the top of his torso. The problem with this Skeletor, though, is while his arms look okay, it just looks like, for example, like with his torso being so big like this, maybe the biggest issue for me is that the abdomen area isn't long enough and it isn't tapered enough. He basically just has himself like a box body. Had this only been a case where the torso was a little bit more narrower and maybe like the abdomen area was a little longer, maybe like even that, I think he would look a little bit better in size. One thing I will say, though, is I love the head sculpt, though, for the new Skeletor. Initially kind of thinking, though, that maybe some too much dark color was added to the front of his face. I really think it works quite well for Skeletor. Now, he doesn't have as much of the green as, again, like Brah, so I'm so glad I held on to this. Yeah, I know he has been, unfortunately, colored with marker. I guess the person who had originally bought this, or originally owned it, felt the need to go in there and colored it up with green marker. It's not much of an eyesore. I mean, I can still live with the fact that, like, Skeletor would have had an originally green face anyways. Maybe had they found a way to incorporate some of the green to the top of his face as well, that would have maybe helped to make this guy look a little bit more like the vintage days, but yeah, you know what? That's a good-looking Skeletor head. The colors look really good on him as well, and one thing I really like that the cartoon collection failed so miserably at, they actually leave a space right underneath the jaw area of Skeletor's face, so it doesn't actually look like he's just molded into the rest of the hood. Now, with this also being the case that Skeletor always, like even with the original ones, and all the ones we've gotten since, Skeletor's hood always seems to be a separate piece from the rest of his armor. So, if you don't mind the fact that obviously Skeletor's hood clearly isn't part of his armor, at least the neck saves this guy. Actually, when I got this guy out of the packaging, his head was down like this, and I thought, oh no, that looks even worse. But though, if you actually just bring the neck up a little bit, it kind of helps just a little bit. It doesn't save the day, though, because obviously it's just too swollen down below here. But with the neck, it does at least give him a little bit better proportions. I really like the armor here that he's got on the top of his torso. Now again, like this, the original Skeletor would have had this, although they went now in here and they've also painted this a metallic purple instead of just relying on the darker purple. I really like the dark purple. I really like the purple that they used for the hood, and I also really like the coloring that they've given this pastel blue for his body. He's got it in his torso, obviously anywhere that skin has the blue. And this Skeletor is actually quite different too, because he also has monster feet. Truth be told, though, all Skeletors tend to have monster feet, but they usually end up showing his feet. This is one of the few Skeletors outside of the battle armor that actually now has monster boots. It's really nice on this figure as well. Now, speaking of that new Eternia Skeletor, one thing that's actually kind of interesting too is that they are using the exact same ball joints for their heads. So if you did want to, say you don't really like this body as much as, well, as maybe the person next to you, you can also then take the heads off of these two figures and you can actually swap them around. So just to show you guys what that looks like, even though really like his torso armor, and I mean, again, you could probably have gone in there too and stripped the armor down and just swap the bodies around. This probably would end up sitting a little bit loose though by default just because he's a little bit more tapered here. But if you wanted to, I suppose you probably could swap the pieces around and get a more closer looking resemblance of Skeletor. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you could even pop the boots off. I'm not going to try to risk doing that just in case they don't want to come off so easily. But if you did want to, you could swap the bodies around and just use, like, obviously the new Eternia Skeletor and use just the head for the vintage collection. Let's pop that back off, put it back where it belongs. So yeah, you know, just to run again through this, I like the head, I like the paint, I love the body. Well, I like the coloring of the body. The only thing that just doesn't work for me, at least, and only just for me, my own personal opinions, I just think like this is too big. And it was way too big also with He-Man. I know some would say, like, He-Man's the most powerful man in the universe. Yeah, he should have a big torso. He should have a big torso, but he shouldn't have big pecs like this. Just my personal opinion. Now, for Skeletor's articulation, going back to his head sculpt here, what a great looking head. Head's going to be on a ball joint, yeah, so it rotates all the way around. It's going to look down, it's going to look up, and it does all the things in the middle. The upper torso also going to be on a ball joint, which is nice to see. You could also kind of bring the torso up a little bit just to kind of balance things a bit. If you bring it down, obviously it's going to draw more attention to the fact that he's just so squat right here. Just kind of arch it back just a bit. But yeah, he does have an upper torso ball joint. He only seems to have a swivel in his waist. The arms rotate all the way around, even though despite the fact he has these little shoulder skirtings, yeah, his arms easily still rotate. Can you bring him out in a T-pose? You can bring him out in a T-pose, so thanks for asking. He has a swivel there in the bicep. The figure does have a single hinge, a double hinge, I should say, in the elbow. The thing about the double hinge, though, is just because of the size of mass that he's got here for the bicep and equally large forearms, you can't quite get a full double hinge. So even though they do pack that on this figure, you really can't make the most use out of it. Hands do rotate, yeah, all the way around. You can hinge them back and forth as well. Skeletor's legs, in fact, do split. There's ball joints working behind the scenes. Hey, guys. How you guys doing? Yo, you doing good? That's good to know. Okay, stop looking at his crotch. The figure's legs obviously move forward. They move back as well. 3/4 of the way up the thigh, there's a swivel cut. Swivel, swivel, swivel. The figure does also have a double hinge on his knee. Articulation here for the boots, which again makes me think you could take off the boots and swap them around, but I don't really feel like I want to Frankenstein the figure. I mean, I like this. I like these, and I like certainly the head. This is the only part for me that isn't working. But again, like, he does have an ankle pivot up and down, an ankle rocker back and forth. And just in case you're curious, the evil, like, Lord of Snake Mountain does also, in fact, have pegals on the bottoms of his feet. Is a good-looking Skeletor. It is for the most part. Now, again, it's only my personal opinion. My opinion may not matter. And you may look at this and think, you know what? I like the larger, swollen torso. In fact, I really liked it quite a lot for the vintage He-Man. So if you're that kind of collector that likes all those things, you're probably going to love Skeletor. And, you know, in the end, I still like the look of this Skeletor. He was a little bit more expensive to try to track this one down. But, you know, again, like, for a while, I had sort of this Skeletor, the Barbarian Skeletor from the new Eternia, sort of being my stand-in Skeletor on my shelf. I may feel like I'm going to end up retiring this, even though I like the proportions better for this body. I mean, obviously, at the end of this, if you guys want really a figure that looks more like the vintage Skeletor, the one that we're getting now in the vintage collection probably is the closest thing to that. It's not perfect, granted, because again, like, some of the issues I already expressed, several times already in this video, but man, oh man, it's still a fine-looking Skeletor to pick up, if, though, you get the chance to find one. Now, I expected originally to have to go to eBay to try to track down a vintage Skeletor. I was pleased, in fact, to find instead that Amazon had a listing for him. That was until, of course, I bought it, and not realizing right away, it wasn't actually Amazon that was selling it or had the listing for Skeletor. It was a third-party seller through Amazon. Not that the seller was fraudulent or I paid way much more than I was really expecting to pay for Skeletor, but what unusually was the case when you buy anything from Amazon, what you got like one to 3 days before this thing shows up at your doorstep, because it was being sold by the seller instead, I ended up waiting about 2.5 weeks for Skeletor to arrive. So unfortunately though, because of that, this review got postponed, moved up by about that time. Skeletor finally getting him in hand, I was pleased to see that, yeah, he does look good. He's still, though, I don't like the top of his torso being as big like this. Now, some of the things I did do, just before we jump to the turntable, is I did make a few little minor adjustments to Skeletor. First of all, I brought his head up as high as I could get, so there's a lot more neck visible here. I also arched back his body, so it looks like his body's stretched a little bit more. And probably the biggest thing, too, is the front skirting that he has for his armor. I pulled it as far down as I could get it, so it's actually now in line with the loincloth. So he's showing a little bit more of his stomach now to kind of balance off the fact that he's so large in the pectoral area. It's the one thing I really wish that they wouldn't do with the vintage collection, and so far we only really have He-Man and Skeletor, but I'm sure that this body will be used again for future Motu vintage figures, and I really do think that they have to kind of reduce the size of the torsos. Maybe if you liked it for He-Man, you might like it for Skeletor. I always really thought it was a big issue facing He-Man, and it still seems to be an issue that's facing Skeletor. I fixed it, he looks a little bit better, but it's still something that's bothering me quite a bit to the figure. Other than that though, I really like the look of the head sculpt. The paint on the skin is really nice. I like that kind of pastel blue that they've used with nice little airbrushings of the darker blue in there as well. I like the coloring that they've used for the purple armor, and that he also has monster boots. It's one of the few times outside of Battle Armor Skeletor of the 7-inch scale that we can actually say that Skeletor has monster boots. What do you guys think of this figure? Let me know down below in the comment section. Have you guys had the chance to pick up vintage collection Skeletor? And do you like the fact that his torso is big as it is? If you guys also did enjoy this video, you can do it a solid and throw it a like. You guys want to stick around for more so? I hope so. We are wrapping up things right now, at least for the vintage collection Skeletor, but there will be more Motu reviews coming your way for the rest of this week. As always, thanks for watching. See you guys next time.